My guest political analyst, Mr. Hassan Habibi, provides a critical assessment of the geopolitical motivations behind the conflicts involving Iran, the United States, and Israel, dismissing regime change as a deceptive pretext for economic and security agendas. He argues that while Israel sought to neutralize nuclear threats, the United States aimed to curtail Chinese influence by controlling regional energy markets. Mr. Habibi characterizes the subsequent ceasefire as a strategic exit for a struggling American administration rather than a resolution for the Iranian people who suffered the most from infrastructural destruction. He specifically critiques the manipulation of opposition figures like Reza Pahlavi, labeling him as tools used to fabricate narrative of popular support for foreign military intervention. Ultimately, this conversation emphasizes that true liberation lies in a third option through the combined efforts of the Iranian populace and organized internal resistance units. The current political structure remains fundamentally unchanged as international powers prioritize regional stability over a genuine democratic transition in Iran. Let's listen in.
Imagine a month-long, just devastating bombing campaign. We were talking about a relentless high-tech barrage, right? Targeting a nation's infrastructure, its universities, its hospitals.
Yeah, absolute deafening destruction on the ground.
Exactly. The physical reality is just chaos. And then suddenly, silence. A 14-day ceasefire is declared.
Right. The dust settles.
Yeah, but when you look at the board, neither the coalition that dropped the bombs nor the regime that was attacked, neither of them seem to have actually achieved what they set out to do.
It's the geopolitical equivalent of two cars colliding at 100 miles an hour.
Right.
And both drivers step out, shake hands, and just agree to stand in the road for 2 weeks.
Wow, yeah.
Nothing is resolved. The wreckage is everywhere. And the underlying disputes that caused the crash in the first place are still just entirely intact.
And honestly, deciphering that wreckage is our mission for today. So welcome to the deep dive. We are analyzing a really fascinating, incredibly dense audio interview today. It's from April 10th, 2026, broadcast on Radio Irava, featuring the political analyst, Mr. Hassan Habibi.
Yeah, it's a really complex piece of media.
It is. We are going to decode his assessment of the U.S. and Israeli bombing of Iran, this sudden ceasefire, and the hidden motives driving all the players involved. But so before we get into it, we need to be completely upfront with you, our listeners.
Absolutely. This is crucial.
Yeah, the audio we are analyzing today contains some highly charged, deeply partisan political viewpoints regarding the United States, Israel, the Iranian regime, the exiled Pahlavi opposition, and armed internal resistance groups.
Right. And we just want to make it incredibly clear that we aren't here to take sides. We are not endorsing any of the sources' political views.
Definitely not. Our only goal is to act as your guides. Just impartially unpacking his specific claims so you can understand the hidden mechanics of this specific geopolitical narrative. We're just looking at what the source says.
Exactly. Just breaking down the ideas.
So let's start with his first major claim. We've had over a month of bombings, and the stated international goal was, targeting the regime. But Habibi asserts that the U.S. and Israel, even though they're flying in the exact same coalition, had completely divergent agendas.
Oh, totally divergent. Divergent to the point of being almost contradictory.
Really? How so?
Well, if we look at Israel's motive, according to Habibi, it was a pure existential security equation. They were looking squarely at a math problem, basically.
Okay, what kind of math problem?
So over the past couple of decades, Iran had stockpiled roughly 2,000 kilograms of enriched uranium. But the terrifying variable in that equation, the thing Israel was focused on, is that 460 kilograms of it was highly enriched.
Right, and we hear that term, highly enriched, constantly in the news. But the distinction really matters here.
Oh, it matters immensely. That 460 kilograms is the critical threshold. It crosses the line from, material used to power a civilian city grid to the exact grade of material required to fuel a nuclear warhead.
Wow. So it serves no other practical purpose?
Not at all. And in physical terms, 460 kilograms is not some massive, sprawling warehouse of material. It's small.
Small enough to be moved around.
Yeah, moved, hidden, buried deep underground. So Israel's primary overarching objective was to completely zero out Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities. They wanted to obliterate that specific 460 kilograms.
And the infrastructure that created it, presumably.
Exactly. But according to the source, despite a month of dropping ordnance, they failed to achieve that main goal. The uranium is still there.
Man, okay. Which brings us to the United States. If Israel was trying to solve this very specific nuclear math problem, what was Washington doing?
Washington was trying to solve a global macroeconomic problem. Habibi claims the U.S. was not actually driven by the immediate physical threat of a bomb.
Wait, really? Then what was their motive?
Their motive was to exert dominance over the global energy market. Specifically, the U.S. wanted to restrict China's access to Iranian oil.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, and this was part of a much broader global strategy that also involved restricting access in places like Venezuela.
Okay, let's unpack this because it's essentially like two people carpooling in a cab.
That's a good way to look at it.
Right.
Right.
They are riding together. They are splitting the massive financial and diplomatic fare for this whole military operation, but they are shouting completely different directions at the driver.
Yeah, exactly.
The Israeli passenger saying, take me to the underground nuclear facilities. We have to dismantle a physical threat. And the American passenger saying, no, take me to the global energy transit routes. I need to bottleneck a global economic competitor.
And that cab ride analogy, it perfectly explains the massive disconnect between what the public was told and the actual military strategy on the ground. Habibi points out that regime change, which, let's be honest, dominated Western news networks, was merely a convenient smokescreen for the U.S.
But if the U.S. didn't actually want regime change, why spend so much time talking about, liberating the Iranian people? That was everywhere.
Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, the reality of what the U.S. actually prefers is pretty unpalatable to say out loud.
Okay, what do they prefer?
Habibi argues that the United States prefers a weak, economically crippled but unified Iran. Washington's nightmare scenario is that the central regime collapses entirely.
Because then the nation fragments.
Exactly. It fragments into multiple heavily armed competing factions. And if a major oil-producing nation shatters into territorial warlords, it causes a catastrophic, totally unpredictable shock to the global economic system.
So they want the regime locked in a box, but they still want someone holding the keys to the oil reserves.
You nailed it. That's exactly the dynamic the source is describing.
But, the exiled opposition's failure to spark an uprising leaves us with this huge paradox. We had highly publicized calls on January 8th and 9th from figures abroad, basically telling the Iranian people to rise up while the bombs were dropping.
Yeah, the rhetoric was really intense.
And Habibi specifically takes aim at Reza Pahlavi here, right?
He does, and he uses a very deliberate, kind of striking political metaphor. Habibi states that Pahlavi was used as an egg in the baskets of Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu.
An egg? Because an egg doesn't hatch itself, it's carried.
It's carried, it's fragile, and ultimately it's consumed by the person carrying it.
Wow, that's vivid.
Right. Habibi's point is that Pahlavi wasn't an autonomous player making his own strategic decisions. He was a prop. He was utilized to create a false, easily digestible narrative for the international community.
So pushing this exiled figure forward allowed foreign powers to say, hey, we aren't just destroying infrastructure to manipulate oil markets, we are supporting the legitimate democratic liberation of the Iranian people.
Precisely. And Habibi is just merciless when it comes to the media apparatus supporting this illusion, too. He points to the exiled opposition media. He actually refers to a network as Ashgal International.
Which literally translates to Garbage International.
Yes, Garbage International. He accuses them of wildly inflating the numbers of protesters abroad to manufacture this fake momentum. The specific rally in Toronto, where organizers claim between 400,000 and 700,000 attendees.
Wait, 500,000 people?
Yeah, and this is where he applies simple physical logic to puncture the narrative. When you calculate the square footage and factor in the physical space a human body occupies, it is geographically and mathematically impossible to fit 500,000 people into that corridor.
So it was a manufactured illusion meant to simulate global consensus.
According to the source, yes, exactly.
But wait, if the people on the ground in Iran are watching their infrastructure get leveled, and they see foreign networks inflating crowds and pushing an exiled leader who has no real power, wouldn't they realize they were being played?
Yeah, you'd think so.
How did the actual civilian population react to the bombs dropping?
Well, the disillusionment was almost immediate. While the source notes there might have been a tiny, fleeting moment of false hope fueled by those initial broadcasts.
Sure, people grasping at straws.
Right. But the reality of high explosives cures illusions very quickly. When the strikes hit, the population did not rise up in a joyous, coordinated revolution to support the foreign coalition.
Because bombs do not differentiate between a democratic dissident and a regime loyalist. They just destroy the neighborhood.
Exactly. The population focused entirely on raw survival. Habibi describes civilians fleeing north, abandoning cities for the countryside, or simply, sheltering in the rubble.
Just trying to stay alive.
Yeah. They understood quickly that foreign jets were not delivering democracy. Habibi frames this using an interesting Persian concept. He calls it a fight over the mullah's blanket.
So externally, the coalition is failing to hit its true targets, and the opposition's narrative is just crumbling. That forces us to look at the internal front. If the people are terrified and hiding, the regime should feel somewhat secure, right?
You would think so, but no. Habibi suggests the regime actually escalated its violence against its own citizens while the bombs were dropping.
Why? Why were they so terrified of a population that was just trying to survive?
This is perhaps the darkest insight in Habibi's whole analysis. The regime's true existential fear is not the American military or the Israeli Air Force. Their ultimate nightmare is the 90 million Iranian citizens.
Their own people.
Yes. An external war provides the perfect chaotic cover for sweeping internal suppression. When the bombs were dropping and the international community's eyes were fixed entirely on the geopolitics, the regime tightened its grip to a lethal degree.
The source mentions the regime escalated executions during the strikes, right? Specifically, I think the hanging of 7 18-year-old youths and the execution of 6 members of the PMOI.
Yes, the PMOI, or the Mojahedin Ikhalth. For context, this is a long-standing, heavily entrenched, and deeply organized opposition group that the regime has historically viewed as a primary internal threat.
So they took advantage of the distraction.
Absolutely. By executing its members alongside teenagers during a foreign bombardment, the regime is sending a terrifying internal message. Habibi argues the regime has to keep this killing machine running constantly.
Like if they stop, they lose control.
Exactly. If they pause the executions, their internal security forces might lose their edge, and that carefully cultivated atmosphere of absolute terror begins to dissipate.
But they needed to maintain that fear factory because of what Habibi introduces next. Here's where it gets really interesting. He talks about the third factor.
Ah, yes, the third factor.
All right, so beyond the foreign powers and the central regime, there is the Kanuni Shirishi, or the resistance units. He claims that during this massive, chaotic bombing campaign, these armed cells carried out 740 separate operations across Iran.
740 coordinated strikes, while the sky is literally falling.
But logically, how does that even work? If the country is under international bombardment, power grids are failing, cell towers are taking hits, central communication is nearly impossible. How are internal resistance units coordinating 740 operations under those conditions?
It comes down to the architecture of the resistance versus the architecture of the regime. Habibi outlines what he calls a formula for overthrow.
Okay, what's the formula?
You have a population that is completely exhausted, angry, and stripped of everything to lose. That general rage merges with these highly trained, localized resistance units. The key word there is localized.
So they aren't relying on a central command post in Tehran to tell them when to attack.
No, not at all. And that is their greatest advantage during a blackout. These units are decentralized citizens. They know the back alleys, they know the neighborhoods, and most importantly, they know the exact identities and routines of the local security forces.
Right, they live there.
Exactly. Contrast that with the regime's security architecture. Habibi points out that the regime's iron grip is incredibly top-heavy. Their elite military and security apparatus is overwhelmingly concentrated in Tehran to protect the central leadership.
So the center is fortified, but the periphery is vulnerable.
Precisely. When you look at smaller provinces, places like Abadan, Kurdistan, or Sistan and Baluchistan, the security presence is much weaker.
The local suppressors are isolated.
Yeah, they don't have the overwhelming numbers or the anonymity they enjoy in the capital. Habibi notes that during protests, parents of killed youths would openly name the local security officer who pulled the trigger, promising vengeance.
Wow. That's intense.
So when centralized communications go down due to foreign bombs, the regime's local apparatus is suddenly cut off and totally isolated. That is when these localized, decentralized resistance units strike.
It is a terrifyingly potent formula. But that brings us crashing back to the present reality, right? The 14-day ceasefire.
Right, the pause.
The bombs have temporarily stopped. Negotiations are happening. But the diplomatic landscape has subtly shifted. Habibi points out that negotiations are currently being mediated by Islamabad, Pakistan, whereas Qatar seems to have lost its primary seat at the table. Why that specific shift?
It is a shift from financial leverage to physical geographic leverage. Qatar has historically been a crucial diplomatic and financial mediator in the region, sure.
They usually handle this stuff.
They do, but Pakistan represents a totally different reality. Pakistan shares a massive, porous, physical border with Iran, and crucially, Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state.
Ah, okay. The stakes change.
Exactly. When the stakes escalate to the potential destruction of nuclear facilities and the threat of regional fragmentation, the mediation naturally shifts to the neighboring power that possesses its own nuclear deterrent and controls the immediate land border.
That makes a lot of sense. And yet, despite this massive military escalation, Western countries have deliberately kept their embassies open in Iran. If you are bombing a nation's infrastructure, wouldn't the logical first step be to pull your diplomats and completely isolate the regime?
You would think so, yeah. But Habibi stresses that keeping those embassies open has absolutely nothing to do with conferring political legitimacy on the regime.
Then what is it?
It is born out of brutal, pragmatic necessity. He gives us a fascinating real-world example regarding France. Apparently, President Emmanuel Macron had a ship stuck in the Gulf of Oman.
A commercial ship.
Right. And if you completely shutter your embassy and sever all ties, who do you call to negotiate safe passage for that vessel? You need someone on the ground with a direct phone line to the people holding the guns, even if the relationship is purely transactional.
So the embassies are essentially just crisis hotlines.
Exactly. And the most pressing crisis right now is finding a way out. The U.S. desperately needs this 14-day ceasefire to transition into a permanent exit ramp.
Because they haven't achieved their economic goals.
Right, and they are terrified of broader regional destabilization. But this raises an important question. There is a massive, glowing sticking point preventing any deal.
The 460 kilograms of highly enriched uranium.
Yes. For the U.S. and Israel to walk away and declare any sort of victory, the Iranian regime must hand over that specific stockpile. When Habibi assesses the probability of that happening, he doesn't mince words. He says there is a 95% chance, and then he actually immediately corrects himself to say it is an absolute 100% certainty that the regime will never, under any circumstances, hand over that material.
Because it's their leverage.
It is their ultimate insurance policy against total destruction.
So if giving up the uranium is a hard no, and the appeasement strategy of the last 4 decades has failed, and a month of heavy bombing didn't erase the threat, I mean, you're implying we are staring at a complete dead end. What scenarios does Habibi actually see playing out here?
He outlines 3 scenarios, and I'll be honest, none of them offer a clean resolution.
Okay, let's hear them.
Scenario 1 is the most likely immediate outcome. The regime uses this 14-day breather to dig deeper, regroup, rearm, and then they strategically break the ceasefire themselves when they have the tactical advantage.
Which puts the coalition right back to square one, but facing a much more prepared adversary.
Right, it's a delay tactic. Scenario 2 is unilateral action. Israel decides the ceasefire is fundamentally flawed because the uranium is still sitting there.
Well, they go rogue.
Yeah, they break from the U.S. strategy and unilaterally resume targeted strikes, just attempting to force that math problem to 0.
But if a conventional strike didn't work before, and they won't hand over the uranium, I mean, you're implying someone might resort to unconventional weapons.
And that is scenario 3. Habibi refers to it as the dark scenario. He warns that we are dealing with a regime that he describes as a rogue force, an entity that fundamentally does not play by the established rules of international conflict.
All right.
If pushed into a corner with the regime's survival on the line and no conventional way out, the unthinkable suddenly becomes a tactical option.
So the use of unconventional or tactical nuclear weapons actually enters the realm of possibility.
Yes, that's what he's suggesting.
Wow. We started this analysis looking at a 14-day ceasefire, which usually implies, a de-escalation or a step toward peace. But what Habibi's analysis reveals is that this entire military event is just a mask for incredibly layered, conflicting agendas.
It really is.
You have the U.S. prioritizing the bottlenecking of global oil markets. You have Israel focused squarely on an existential nuclear threat. You have the Iranian regime using external attacks to justify the brutal execution of its own people to maintain terror. And you have an exiled opposition utilized as a convenient prop to sell the war to the public.
It really forces you to completely reevaluate how you consume international news. When a headline reads, ceasefire declared, it feels like a victory.
Yeah, it feels like it's over.
But when you understand the underlying mechanics, the unyielding 460 kilos of uranium, the 740 internal resistance operations happening in the dark, the overarching fear of a global market crash, you realize the ceasefire is just a temporary holding pattern in a much larger, entirely unresolved crisis.
It totally changes how you look at the entire region. But before we wrap up, there was one last historical thread Habibi pulled at that really recontextualizes this entire modern conflict.
Yes, and I think it's the absolute perfect thought to leave you with. Amidst all the modern geopolitical chess, Habibi brings up a name from the mid-20th century, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh.
The Iranian prime minister who was overthrown in a coup in 1953.
Exactly. For those who might not be familiar with the deep history, Mossadegh was a democratically elected leader whose defining policy was the nationalization of Iran's oil industry.
He wanted Iran to own its own oil.
Yes. He believed the vast energy resources beneath Iranian soil should belong to the Iranian state, not to foreign powers extracting it for massive profits, and because he threatened the global flow of cheap energy, he was removed from power.
Right.
Habibi uses Mossadegh to make a deeply unsettling claim about the present day. He says that, fundamentally, the major global powers do not actually want a true functioning democracy in Iran today.
Wait, why not? Wouldn't a democratic, stable nation be a better partner on the global stage than a rogue, unpredictable regime?
Because a true democracy, as Habibi defines it, is a Mossadegh democracy. It means sovereign control. If the Iranian people had a true democratic government, they would take ownership of their own oil and gas. They would dictate the terms of their energy exports, the prices, and who gets access.
And for a global economy that relies desperately on stable, easily manipulatable energy flows, an independent, democratic, resource-rich Iran is actually viewed as a massive economic threat.
Exactly. So the harsh reality is that the world wants the oil to flow without interruption. And a dictator holding a country hostage with an iron grip might actually be easier to negotiate with, or at least easier to predict, than a messy, independent democracy that puts its own citizens' wealth first.
Man, so the thought I want you to mull over long after this deep dive ends is this. When we look at resource-rich nations struggling for freedom, is the greatest barrier to human rights simply the internal dictator holding the gun? Or is the true barrier the global economy's absolute unyielding reliance on stable, easily manipulatable energy markets?
Do the global powers who buy the oil actually want the people who live above it to be free?
That is a heavy, essential question to carry with you. We started this deep dive looking at a board that was a complete illogical mess after a bombing campaign. And maybe the reason the board is so messy is because the players aren't actually trying to win a clean game. They're just trying to keep the lights on in their own countries, regardless of the rubble left behind.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking past the headlines, keep questioning the underlying mechanics of the narratives, and we'll catch you on the next one.